you. So thank you for this opportunity. And I'm just very excited that you're doing this. And I think it's a very important initiative. And particularly, I'm excited about the emphasis on the South Asian perspective. So I can't tell you, even though I've spent lots of time in India, I can't tell, and some in Sri Lanka, I can't give you a South Asian perspective on your discipline, but there are questions that I might ask that may be helpful or not. So I'll share my screen now. Oops. Okay, so question, you might be asking is how might I move towards a Christian perspective on my academic discipline in a South Asian context? So you might ask if whether this is a legitimate academic exercise, particularly in a pluralist secular society, and where some people would say that theology has no role in the university. But the first thing that's important to do, I've found, is to know your discipline. And I don't mean by that to know what's in the textbooks. I think everyone here will know what's in the textbooks, but it's more to know it in a different sense and to get different perspectives. And so I'll talk about a philosophical, historical, cultural perspective, and also an economic and political perspective. But then I want to focus on a theological perspective. And one thing I've found helpful is to think of this in terms of 4 biblical themes or concepts of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And I'll say something just briefly about some South Asian context. And then, as Savitri mentioned, there's the question of, how should a Christian practice the discipline? But one thing I'd encourage you to do before you get into the theology, and I think it might be Vinod who prompted these questions, but it's worth just thinking about, particularly as we're overwhelmed with teaching, administration, and various things, we lose sight of, well, why did we originally choose this discipline? And what is it that we're passionate about in the discipline? And what gets you excited about your discipline? I mean, I'm still, in physics, and there's things about physics that I'm still very excited about. So, but now, I'm sorry if some of that gets covered. Is there a way? No. I can move that down. So why is a Christian perspective justified and academically legitimate? Well, Alistair McIntyre was a very important philosopher, and this book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality? He says all rational human inquiry is conducted, whether knowingly or not, from within a tradition. So everyone's starting with certain assumptions, certain ways of doing things, certain values. And that's still true of academic disciplines, whether it's, physics or law. And so I would say that looking at your discipline from a Christian perspective within a Christian tradition, it is something which is valid, it's academically legitimate, and I would say it's very important. Even And so the IFES journal Word and World had a whole issue about what is a university for. And if you wonder, you can look at the article I wrote about Towards a Christian Vision for the Modern Secular University, and make the point that there's many competing visions of what the university is for, but there's a strong case to be made that there, even for the modern secular university, a Christian vision has something to contribute. Oops. So here's some questions that you might ask about your discipline. And so one is, what are the key assumptions of the discipline? And I'll give some examples. What are the central concepts and ideas of the discipline? And what's a holy grail for the discipline? I'll explain what I mean by holy grail, a great big goal that someone has. And what are some major contested issues within the discipline? So so these are examples of assumptions. And when we're doing our discipline, often we just forget, because we're so immersed in it, what some of these assumptions are. And it's interesting to, if you actually look from outside your discipline, you can see them. So in science, in physics, there's an assumption that there are laws of nature and that these can be encoded mathematically, and that these laws are the same everywhere and at all times. Now, we now have lots of empirical evidence that this is true, but it's still an assumption. Another assumption, particularly in physical sciences, is that there's objective physical reality which exists independent of subjective observers. And so that it doesn't matter whether you do the observation or I do, the result should be the same. And whether it's the experiments done in Sri Lanka, or it's done in Paris, it shouldn't matter. Now, scientific induction, and this is the foundation of scientific methods, is that specific observations can be generalized to universal claims, which, if you reflect a little bit, is a pretty bold assumption. But it is an assumption. Now, if you're in history, one of the assumptions would be that the historical past can be reconstructed and understood by analysis of primary documents. We don't have any way to, interview people from things about that happened 200 years ago or 500 years ago, but we do have some documents and we can analyze those. But it's an assumption that that's actually a worthwhile exercise and actually would produce some reliable knowledge and some insight. In economics, one of the assumptions is often that humans are rational agents. In other disciplines, humans are moral and rational agents. So these are just examples, but so that's something to think about. What are these assumptions? Because later we want to come back and look at from a theological perspective, would these assumptions be justified? Now, every discipline has some really key concepts and ideas. In physics, one of the ideas is that something called symmetry, and this is related to things like conservation laws, conservation of energy, conservation of momentum. And in molecular biology, the whole idea of the genetic code, and the DNA provides genetic information that then tells proteins what amino acid sequence to make. In economics, there's concepts about division of labor, scarcity, incentives, and equilibrium. In sociology, a concept is that human agency is constrained by social structures. So again, think of your discipline and what are some of the big, the big ideas there, the central things. So what's a holy grail of the discipline? So this is what often if people are making a research grant application or an introduction to a paper, they'll talk about this is what our goal is. And so I would suggest that every discipline has a holy grail, may have several. So the holy grail is just this big goal that people dream of reaching. And so in pharmacology, the whole idea of being able to design drugs, sometimes being able to design them on the computer. And I work in material science, and there's this dream of materials by design that you would say to me, I want a material that's a good conductor of electricity, but I want it to be very flexible, and but I also want it to rarely break. And then the idea is one could go on the computer and come up with the relevant chemical formula and how to make the material. This is a holy grail. In medicine, a holy grail is to find the genetic basis for all diseases and then to find ways to treat those diseases. Economics, the goal is, to prevent recessions, to promote gold, to be able to just promote continual economic growth, prosperity for all, and so on. In physics, there's something called the theory of everything or string theory. This is a holy grail. Another thing in physics is a quantum computer. And you can see cheap and sufficient solar energy, or in political science, international relations, wanting to, prevent all wars or now it's good to have a historical perspective on your discipline. I mean, an unfortunate thing in the way science is taught today, natural sciences, is that usually students don't learn any of the history of science or the philosophy of science. And it's worth thinking about who were some of the key people who founded the discipline, because most disciplines is actually only, a small number of really key people. And is there any sense in which their personal backgrounds or values or beliefs influence their approach? And so, for example, sociology, often people would say that Durkheim, Karl Marx, and Max Weber were the founders. And so how did their values and beliefs might have influenced the beginning of sociology? And what are the major achievements of the discipline? But also, what are some failures of their discipline? Many disciplines have not lived up to their promise of what people were hoping, when they started. And this doesn't just relate to holy grails, but just other things that people really thought they were going to be able to understand, that we seem to be floundering. So here's an example of where thinking about the founders is valuable. Is that I have a colleague at University of Queensland, Peter Harrison. He's a very distinguished historian, and one of the ways he became famous was writing books such as this, The Bible, Protestantism, and the Rise of Natural Science, and the Fall of Man and the Foundations of Science. And the point he makes compellingly is that if you look at the founders of natural science, people like Boyle, Newton, Bacon, is that they were really driven by theological convictions, by biblical theology developed from, their study of the Bible. And so that's one example of where it's worth knowing about the, the founders of your discipline. Then sociological, cultural, and anthropological perspectives. And so what are some of the factors that have influenced the founding growth, struggles, and successes of their discipline? And in terms of sociology, is there social, career, and funding pressure to accept and promote certain points of view within your discipline? And then economic and political perspectives. Who funds research in the discipline? And what influence does this have on research priorities and outcomes? And what power structures does the discipline support or undermine? So Derek Bock was a professor of Harvard University, which is the wealthiest university in the world. And after he was president, he wrote this book, Universities in the Marketplace, the Commercialization of Higher Education. And he points out that how the whole mission of the university is being compromised basically because of money. Universities are jeopardizing their fundamental mission and their eagerness to make money by agreeing to more and more compromises with basic academic values. This is particularly relevant, I would say, to South Asia. And this is an article from Stanford, Attention to Local Health Burden and the Global Disparity of Health Research. And so what the authors did was they just surveyed, what globally, what are people doing research in medicine? And they say our findings highlight how poor populations not only face the greatest burden from disease and disability, but that burden is given the least medical research attention. So first, medical research activities are guided by local health needs specific to each country rather than global health needs, and the health needs vary greatly across rich and poor populations. Second, as medical research requires resources, a few developed countries disproportionately produce the vast majority of biomedical research. And so that is basically focused on, Western diseases, often things of affluence. So I hope that just gives you an idea of some questions you might ask about your discipline, just to get to know it better. I want to move to the theological perspective. And this is just a way that I've found sort of helpful and manageable in terms of trying to think about it. And so God the Father has reconciled his created but fallen world through the death of his Son and renews it into a kingdom of God by his Spirit. This is a Reformed theologian. And so the key thing here is that there's four major theological themes, which basically capture the narrative of the whole Bible: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And if we had more time and we're doing this like a seminar, I would get you to go away and try to give a clear, succinct statement of each of these themes and also what's the biblical basis. But I'll just tell you now some of how I would say it. So if we look about creation, we look at passages like this, not just Genesis, but Job, John, Colossians. And so some of the key ideas are everything that exists was made by God the Father through Jesus the Son. And the creation is good, and it's for the purpose of God's glory. Humanity is made in the image of God, and the creation is ordered and reflects the power and faithfulness of the Creator. We come to the fall, which again is not just Genesis, Romans and many other passages. As a result of the rebellion of humanity, the whole of creation has been corrupted and frustrated. Humans are in conflict with God, with each other, and with nature. And human reason and communication is corrupted. And so particularly this last one has implications to just doing any academic discipline. And so this is a question of to what extent can we successfully discern the truth and communicate the truth, whether it's about physics or history, given our fallen nature. But there is redemption, and through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, all of the fallen creation has been reconciled to God, and it is being restored now, but not yet, as believers live with the Holy Spirit. And then there's we look forward to the restoration where heaven and earth will be united, and there'll be a new creation, or the current creation will be restored following the final judgment. And then there'll be complete harmony between God, humanity, and nature. These are just a couple of books that I've found helpful in trying to think these kind of issues through. And so now we come to the discipline. So maybe ask, what does your discipline assume about God? God doesn't exist, or God is irrelevant. What does it assume about nature? And what does it assume about humanity? About truth, about morality, about justice, about destiny? Because all disciplines do their human enterprises, they do make assumptions about these things. Now, if we have this theological perspective, creation, fall, redemption, restoration, how does that revise our view of the Holy Grail of the discipline? Maybe the Holy Grail's not that worthwhile. Maybe it's never attainable. Maybe it is attainable. Maybe it aligns with kingdom values. And how does the theological perspective revise our view of the presuppositions of the discipline? So now just some questions about South Asian context. So how is your discipline practiced in your context. And how is it taught? What's the goal of what students become graduates? What are they being trained to do? Is it so that they can get high-paying jobs in the West, or is it so that they can serve local communities, or they can stay in where they are and work for large corporations, or they can work in the civil service? So, but then particularly, how does your discipline interact with issues such as poverty, gender violence, caste, Hindu nationalism, environmental degradation? Now, you know, physics may not have anything specific to say about these issues, but what physics is used for may have a lot to say, and also what how the discipline is taught may have a lot to say about these issues. I just want to raise a question about, is your discipline dominated by Western issues, priorities, values, and approaches? And my son's an economist, and he brought to my attention this this article, which is it's called "Premature Imitation in India's Flailing State," and the main point of the article is that too much Indian the authors claim and argue that too much Indian public policy is determined by Indian elites who basically want to imitate Western elites and policies in the West, but the Indian state does not have the capacity to, you know, implement those policies. But I think there's some broader issues here just about imitation. And so if you look at, you know, whether it's the physics curriculum or the English literature curriculum, how much is that just imitating what's taught, you know, at Harvard and Cambridge? Now, that may not be necessarily a bad thing, but it's worth thinking about, is that really in the, you know, the best interests of students? Is that what's most relevant? So, and the same applies to, you know, research topics. How much is it that in South Asian context, people are doing research basically on what's the hottest topics, you know, that people in the West are doing? So it'd be good to have a discussion about that. And then we have day-to-day reality that academics, we have to get up tomorrow, go to work, and we actually do it. We do the discipline, we teach it, we do research, but how is it actually practiced versus how is it meant to be practiced? And I can give examples of this that, you know, me and my colleagues will be very idealistic about truth and evidence and critical thinking and so on, but sometimes that's not the way people operate. Oh, I just want to, people say, I just want to get this paper published in a good journal, and so they may not say it blatantly. I'll ignore, you know, the results that I don't really understand, and I'll just focus on the results, the data that's good, that supports my theory, and hopefully I'll get it published in a high impact journal, and that will be good for my career. Well, that's not the way the discipline is meant to be practiced. And so how, as a Christian, should I be practicing the discipline? Now, it's important not to reinvent the wheel, And so I want to encourage you to, as you start thinking and writing, to find what resources are out there. And so think about maybe 3 books or articles. One would be a secular critique of your discipline. One would be a Christian view of the discipline. And another would be a South Asian perspective. Now, there may not be, but my experience is if we ask around, we research, there is actually quite a bit of material out there. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily good or helpful or relevant, but it's worth looking at, particularly because it can just refine our thinking. And so these are just, again, sort of 4 random fields of human rights, science, law, economics. And so there's, these are all written by Christians. And again, from largely a Western perspective, but it's still worth reading them and looking at them and seeing what you agree with, what you don't agree with, what's helpful, and what's not. Okay, we don't need that. Okay, so I think that's where I want to end. Happy to happy to answer questions.